your insights with us this afternoon. So as we all listen to Deborah, I'd like us to make some notes on our paper and pen, or using modern technology, so that when we divide into small groups, we can bring some of the challenges that we're hearing from Deborah that may impact our own ministries. And it may be we've got some questions for Deborah, and in our small groups, we can shape some of those questions together. So less from me, more from you, Deborah. Over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. So I guess it's my turn. It sounds like some of you have had a chance to look at my paper already, and thank you for taking the time to do that. I will go through it in a bit of a whirlwind, and so if you feel like it's hard to keep up, please have a look at it afterwards. However, every point that I'm going to make is actually worth a paper in itself, opinion, or even more. I'm going to start out with a definition of cultural dependency, and then I'm going to give you a bit of context, and we'll go on from there. So, cultural dependency invariably puts pressure on one society to adopt the culture, values, and lifestyle of another. This situation is worsened if there is an existence of any form of inequality among the partners, like the type that exists between developed and developing or underdeveloped countries. That seems to me to go right along with what Jim was saying in his introduction. So we're going to focus on culture here. And I often call them traditions, and you'll see why later. So a little bit of the context. When I was in Thailand, I worked with the Shan people, and they are called Thai Yai in Thai, just for those of you who are familiar. And I was in a rural setting, and the Shan people come from Burma or Myanmar, and they come over to Thailand to try to survive, basically, make money, live. They work in agriculture mostly, or on construction sites, for example. And they're basically an oppressed minority in Thailand. I was basically working among them. My goal was to plant churches at the time. And the churches in the area were all made up of Thai people. They were all Thai churches. There's quite a few Thai churches around, actually. And they all spoke Thai. And there were no churches among the Shan. There's still very few. The Thai people don't learn the Shan language. They just don't. For them, it would be a step downward. However, Shan people learn Thai. However, the Thai are also quite wealthy in comparison to the Shan. And as you see, this can set up a bit of a struggle in how do you plant churches among these people? And I struggled a lot with the dominance of the Thai Christian culture, as well as the dominance of my own Christian culture, and how to really help the Shan in the best way possible. So that's a little bit of the context. Yeah, so I'm going to begin. Point number one is, what is the difference between culture and religion? We often believe, missionaries often believe, that foreign culture is a good thing. Culture itself is good. Non-Christian religion, however, is bad. And therefore, it's necessary to separate the two out. And which is culture, which is religion. I was doing this in my first years in Thailand. I was convinced that that was the way to go about it. However, I was completely unaware that the concept of world religions in the first place was designed by the Western world and came from Christianity. The mindset, or the idea of world religions, came from the Enlightenment, and it's not a part of the Eastern worldview. It wasn't even, the Enlightenment didn't impact the East very much. The Eastern worldview tends to be more holistic, so they're not separating culture and religion. So this is a major root of cultural dependency right from the beginning. So the false construct of different religions focuses on contrasts and divisions. And if we laid them aside, it could lead actually to much more openness to the good news At least that's been my experience. Point number 2 is bringing Western theology and ways of doing church. So most theology books that you find in Thailand, or if not all, are translated from English. And that made me wonder, do Westerners own theology, or is theology in the first place a Western idea? And I think many times we are overly focused on getting it right. We want to get everything right. Therefore, we think that theology is so important. So we become the channel through which God speaks to local people or the authority, because we know theology and they don't. However, the Shan, especially, they are only semi-literate. Many of them can read, but it's a struggle, and they basically don't read because it's so hard. So they're an oral society. So we need to keep that in mind. Biblical culture really is more similar to Asian culture than to Western in the first place. So when the Bible is translated, it tends to be translated as a Western book, because choosing terminology to use is actually already making theological decisions. That sounds, yeah, that's true actually for English as well. Many times Buddhism is rejected as a wrong religion. And so therefore we cannot use Buddhist terminology in the Bible, right? So one example, which many of you may be familiar with, is the term nirvana, or niran in sorry, that's wrong. I said the wrong Thai word. But in Thailand, they use the word nirvana to mean basically something eternal and something perfect, something that is not subject to karma. So that word is not used for heaven in the Bible. However, the word sawan is used for heaven. And the word sawan is actually, Buddhists understand that as a lower heaven. It's not a perfect place. It's subject to karma. It's within the karmic realm. So when Buddhists hear that word for heaven, they completely misunderstand what it's about. And it leads them to think, oh, I definitely don't want to go there. So, yeah. Point number 3 is the outsider or missionary as leader. So I found that leading anything perpetuates dependency, because it sets a standard or a model and shows the right way to do things. And the implicit message is that local people are not good enough to do it. So that begs the question then, when are they good enough? And what do they have to do to be good enough? So in my opinion, I was taught to model, assist, watch, and leave. I don't agree with that anymore. I don't think it works. By the time you've already modeled something and assisted, people are already dependent on you. So they don't know what to do when you move into the watch mode, because why aren't you doing it anymore? And it tends to fall apart once you back out, because you've already created a dependent situation. So when we are a leader, we tend to snuff out local people's ways of addressing God through their own traditions and worldview. Many Christians in Thailand don't know how to relate to God outside of Western ways. They only know how to do it using Western culture. So point number 4 is creating a new community of faith, otherwise known as Christians. That tends to set up the idea of superiority. Who is in, who is out? I'm a Christian, I'm in, you're Buddhist, you're out. And it requires people to change their identity. So the European framework of religion sets up a competition between Buddhism and Christianity. I think this is a false competition. People believe that in order to follow Jesus, you have to enter a Western religion. So we impose a framework through that, and that sets the stage for dependency. Point number 5 is extraction from families and communities. So decisions tend to be made in community, And there's not so much of an individual identity, it's a community identity. So when we go and convert individuals, it destroys this community because it takes the person out of their community and it's not a community decision. Christians often say, I can't participate in this ritual, I can't participate in this practice. And they say that to Buddhists. And it doesn't show respect for Buddhist traditions. It ends up causing a sense of betrayal. The Buddhists feel betrayed and can set the stage for persecution for the wrong reasons, unfortunately. It has nothing to do with Jesus. So for example, the Shan have a big festival every year called Boi Sang Long. And the Christians will always say, oh, I'm not going to go there. It's of the devil, that kind of thing. That really made me sad to hear that because I found that it was very beautiful. And it was really a chance for the community to come together and celebrate. And the Christians missed out on it. They separated themselves out. So I also experienced many Shan people in Thailand saying, oh, when I'm in Thailand, I can be a Christian, but when I go back to Burma, I have to be a Buddhist. And that was because their community was in Burma. So they had a sense of false guilt, like, oh, I have to be a Buddhist in Burma. They felt guilty about that, but didn't know what else to do. And that was because the community sense wasn't there. They were extracted. Point number 6 is churches that look and act foreign in the culture. And that tends to focus on external behavior, such as church attendance, baptism, etc. Membership, not on loving Jesus. That is not what Buddhists see from the outside. And it tends to look like slavery, not freedom. And they don't want to join because of it. It's a foreign religion and it looks foreign. The institutions are foreign, the music is foreign, the architecture is foreign, maybe even the leadership is foreign. There's membership, paid staff, projects. It looks like a business. And that can be really confusing to local people. They don't see Jesus through that. They see business, they see foreigners, they see money. Yeah. And point number 7 is that we are actually tied to a long history of colonialism, conversion, domination, and oppression, whether we like to admit it or not. I used to think, oh, I don't have anything to do with that. That was a long time ago. I'm not like that. I'm not a colonialist or whatever. But I had no idea what local people were thinking, what they saw. Yeah, many of you may have heard of the doctrine of discovery, which was kind of a beginning of it. It was a long time ago, but it set the stage for this domination and oppression and colonialism. So in Burma, as an example, obviously they were colonized by the British as a part of British India. The merchants, the missionaries, and the military all came together. So for local people, they couldn't separate what was what, even though many missionaries tried to separate themselves from the merchants and the military because they didn't want to have anything to do with it. But yet conversion was required in order to participate in colonial society and gain status. So conversion and colonialism were intertwined. And that's still very real in people's minds. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go on to part number 2. It's about how to model vulnerable mission in local traditions. Again, focusing on the traditions part of it and not so much the language and resources. We're assuming that that's already in place. Okay, point number 1 is to model correctly for the context. So we always model something, whether we believe it or whether we believe we are or not. My way of thinking about it is if we project it into the future, let's say if I continue to, live as I'm living, do what I'm doing, what does it look like 5-10 years down the road? What will be the result? For example, we get support from overseas, we travel, we have computers. Those are all things that local people see and see as a model. So praying out loud, for example, using fancy religious words, leading a Bible study, Those are all modeling for local people. And I found that the Shan felt very much like they had to do it exactly like I did. So they really tried hard. They think they have to do the same thing. It tends to set the bar too high, and it anyway doesn't fit with their culture and traditions. So I would advocate for more of a meekness or humility and Asian values. And that's a whole, theme in itself. And I'm not going to go into it right here, but just to give an idea where that would go. Point number 2 is to take on the role of a learner, not a leader. I can't remember who it was, but one of you talked about that. And I think Westerners tend to value initiative, work, accountability, and Easterners tend to value more they're part of a patron-client system. And their notions of leadership have more to do with being a patron than they do with Western notions of leadership. So Jesus modeled in a humble example through using relational capital, basically. In my opinion, he was considered a patron in many ways, and he modeled through that. So there's a concept of biblical meekness. There's a Thai man who wrote a PhD thesis on that. His name is Nantachai Mejudon. If any of you are interested in reading that, yes, it's in English. I think it might have been translated from Thai, actually. And it's about biblical meekness and using biblical meekness to share the gospel among the Thai people. Fascinating paper. Actually, it's a PhD, but it's shortened. There's a paper. It's not very short, but. And point number 3 is honoring local structures. So in Thailand, there's basically a hierarchy where everyone contributes to the whole. Planting a church tends to disrupt that and mixes it up and creates power struggles. Because all the people who are in the hierarchy are kind of different hierarchies are all mixed up together, and who is fitting where, and local structures aren't perfect, but they are beautiful and they can reflect God's heart. Our structures are also not perfect. I think it creates an opportunity for the good news to take root and spread when we work through local structures. Point number 4 is to examine our motives and give up the need for control and the fear of syncretism. We don't have to take on the role of the Holy Spirit. I think many missionaries do unintentionally. They wouldn't say they're doing that, but if you really think about it, we tend to come across as stressed out legalists, pushy and aggressive, at least in Thailand, telling people, what is right and what is wrong, and basically helping them not hear from the Holy Spirit and instead taking that role. So, for example, I've seen situations where Shan Christians were forced to apologize in front of the church for having an idol in their house, or they were forced to apologize in front of the church for some kind of trespass that they were accused of doing. I found this to be horrifying, to be honest. I'm not going to go into the whole story right now, but I think the cause is that there's a need for control and a fear of syncretism that is basically forcing people to do that. Point number 5 is to learn spiritual vocabulary and ways of thinking. So the Bible is translated by Christians for Christians using foreign terminology. An example, in the Shan Bible, the Thai Bible has this problem too. The word for baptism is translated baptijam. It sounds ridiculous, frankly. And there are many, many such words. When you hear, when a Shan person hears baptijam, they're thinking, what in the world is that? Unfortunately, there is actually a perfect Shan word for it, and it's not used. The Shan word would be boijom nam. And basically, it means baptism, not necessarily Christian baptism into a foreign religion. but it's a celebration of going underwater. And that opens the door to explain what that means. So my point with this is that not all local language is created equal. That's very important. So we need to learn Buddhist spiritual vocabulary. I would say don't learn the Christian spiritual vocabulary. I did, and I honestly regret it because it prevented me from learning the Buddhist vocabulary. I mean, I can still do it. I still can do it, but you have to break out of the pattern of using the Christian vocab. So that actually makes it easier than you might think to communicate. I found it opens a lot of doors when we use the local spiritual vocab. And so if we can get past the idea that Christianity and Buddhism are in opposition to each other and that it's impossible to communicate what it means to follow Jesus without Western vocabulary, then I think the doors are much more open to local people following Christ. It tends to happen much faster, much more easily because they actually understand what it's about. Point number 6 is stay out of the way. So it's important to let people go to God and each other and the Bible for answers, not to us. We had many people coming and asking us, what should I do about this? What should I do about that? It's important to encourage them to go to each other for these things, go to God, go to the Bible. So we are actually patrons no matter what, and we'll never be complete insiders. So whatever we do has tremendous weight. Therefore, we need to be extra careful. And we're patrons no matter what, basically, because of that we're coming from overseas and speak English and travel, and those things already put us in a higher status. So then it's important to ask, what do I need to show them? How would they do it? Why is it so important that I need to show them? Maybe we don't need to show them certain things. Maybe we need to be careful what we do. Maybe we need to learn local ways of doing things so that we can fit better into the culture and encourage them in a good way. Point number 7 is to use empowering questions. And that is basically a form of coaching. I learned coaching after I left Thailand, and unfortunately, but I still use it in my work there. And it basically draws out what's inside the person. It's non-directive, non-judgmental, and it doesn't rely on the knowledge or experience of the coach. That's super important. However, it must be in a relational context, and it must be someone who's willing to, explore and talk to you about what they're experiencing, what they need, that kind of thing. And it's, like I said, it's not directive. So it helps us also to acknowledge that God has been at work a long time before we arrived, and discover what he's already done there. If we don't take time to listen to people and ask questions, we, for their sake, not for ours, we will see what God has already done. And that can be an amazing journey, an amazing discovery. I've actually, I'm going to go to part number 3 where missionaries get stuck. Yeah. So a lot of missionaries get stuck working in the local church. I've seen that actually, at least in Thailand, most missionaries, at least when I was there, tend to work in the local church, or they work just with Christians. And that is modeling that we should be insulated from Buddhists, or that we should stay in our little Christian bubble and not have much to do with Buddhists. My experience is that actually foreigners tend to be more easily accepted into Buddhist society. It's harder for local Christians who've already given up their identity to be accepted into Buddhist society. So we can model it. And in the local church, missionaries tend to become a crutch. whether or not they're putting money into the church or not, whether or not they're actually have a leadership position. For example, one thing I saw in Thailand, which I found quite troubling, was there was a local Thai church that was basically dependent on short-term teams from overseas to be their outreach. So they would get one short-term team after another, and they would go from village to village, and they would preach the gospel, and everything was translated, as I'm sure you can imagine. And probably there was money flowing there as well. I don't know the details, but it really seemed sad to me that the local church was basically a short-term team reception center. And that doesn't really work very well, if you can imagine, when you're trying to actually tell Buddhist people about Christ. So point number 2 is missionaries get stuck with bonding issues. I mentioned before that many missionaries work in the local church, and the closest friends tend to be foreigners and Christians, not local people. How dependent are we on local people, on Buddhist people, not on Christians? Are we willing to make ourselves vulnerable and be dependent on them? And who would we actually, for example, go on vacation with? Would we go on vacation with Buddhists, or would we go on vacation with Christians or foreigners? I think that is a good question to ask, and it shows where the bonding is happening. And when there's this kind of separation, we tend to view people as targets. So they're targets of our efforts. They're targets of our preaching, our evangelism. And that is more of, these people are more of a commodity than they are individuals or communities who are made in the image of God. So point number 3 is identity issues. So people used to ask me all the time, what are you doing in Thailand? What is your role? And I guess I looked like a missionary. Half the time they would guess it. Half the time I was struggled with, should I say that or should I not? So I tried it out. Sometimes I said, yes, I'm a missionary. And most people were quite happy about that, because, in Thailand, missionaries were the ones that brought schools and hospitals and set them up. And so that part is seen favorably. Yet there's also this kind of wall that goes up, because they're like, oh no, you're here to convert me. So I found that the missionary label, in terms of the cultural issues with local traditions, is not helpful. It tends to demonstrate a lack of vulnerability, and it represents a foreign religion and conversion agenda. And so that is, then the question is, okay, what should your identity be? That's a whole nother issue. I would encourage people to get regular jobs and work in the Buddhist society. Point number 4 is valuing structure over relationships. So we tend to represent the church structure, and it's basically like a business. And that tends to be the priority of church leaders and missionaries. And so when our goal is to plant a church, it's easy to be overly focused on structure instead of on growing relationships. And I kind of touched on that before. People, come and go from a church, but the structure remains. So what is more important? Is it the structure or is it the relationship? And I think, that's something that Western churches tend to be quite terrible at, is they're all about structure. So number 5 is impeding narratives. So we all have narratives in our subconscious or our conscious that we're not, necessarily aware of the impact that they have. One of those tends to be, I can't come under the authority of someone who's in a different religion because God can't work through them. Therefore, I can only come under the authority of other foreigners, which is basically how it works. And that gets in the way. And also the idea of a Christian culture, and that we need to filter out idolatrous aspects of the Buddhist culture, and they have to be replaced by imported Western religion or traditions. So we teach locals this interpretive filter, and thereby we end up disrupting local traditions and actually hinder people from coming to Christ. The next point is number 6, lack of awareness of the patron-client system and how it works. I had no idea about this until my very last couple of years in Thailand. Nobody ever talked about it. And once I figured out what it was all about, everything suddenly made sense, and then I wanted to learn more. It's an example is where I was so baffled was I would, people wouldn't tell me important information that I needed to know. And I already spoke their language. Yeah, and I wasn't giving them any money, but they just wouldn't tell me because I'm supposed to know, because I'm a patron, so my status is higher. And that really frustrated me, actually, because I thought, I want to be part of your community. Please just tell me stuff so that I can learn. People didn't really necessarily want to do that because I was at a higher status. So even without, giving them money, or even when you are using local language, you're still considered to be a patron. So I think the goal is to seek to model to be a humble patron as Jesus was. People called him rabbi. To me, that's a sign that he was a patron. And again, that's a huge topic that needs to be explored all on its own, and there are some things written on it. And the last point is money and language, of course. I just wanted to put that in there at the end, that missionaries, as Jim explained so well in the beginning, tend to get hung up on money and language. So for example, if I went to Shan people and used the Thai language, that's already a problem. And it's important to learn the local language and use local resources, as Jim so well said. So that's it for now. I actually did not look at the time I started, so I have no idea how long I've gone on. So anyway, I'll hand it back over to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Deborah. Very, very helpful. So a first response, I'm asking Marcus to just to come in with some thoughts that he's found during your presentation. And then we're going to give you some pointers about how to use the breakout time. So over to you, Marcus.